It's been a little over a month since I first got my hands on my Nintendo Switch 2, and it has been one of the most underwhelming and amazing experiences I've ever had. This is one of the closest launch windows I've ever experienced when receiving my console. I didn't get my Xbox One until 2015, a couple years after launch. I got my Wii a couple years after launch as well, and I think the previous most closest launch I experienced was the first Nintendo Switch, only getting that one a few months after release. And even by that point, the Switch's library was pretty extensive and started to fill out quite nicely alongside the massive eShop, which was home to so many amazing titles at launch. And the Switch 2, though, this is the closest I've ever been. I got my Switch roughly a week after it initially came out. And I would say buying a Nintendo Switch 2 at launch wasn't amazing, primarily because there just really weren't that many games that, at least for me personally, I found especially interesting. Cyberpunk, I've played it on my gaming PC and my Steam Deck, so the novelty of having a game like that on the go has seriously worn off. And the game I'm pretty much most excited for is Elden Ring, which at least at the moment doesn't even have a release date. And Bonanza comes out Thursday this week, which is incredibly exciting, but I'm not a huge Donkey Kong fan, so I don't really care about Donkey Kong Bonanza. It looks like a great game. Apparently it's made by some of the developers who were behind Mario Odyssey, which is incredibly exciting. I loved Mario Odyssey. I don't care for Donkey Kong as a character, and the whole punching and digging through the ground stuff just doesn't look appealing to me, so I'm probably not going to pick it up. So out of the long list and extensive that is actually, I haven't found a single launch title to actually play. So in this month span that I've actually had my Switch 2, outside of Mario Kart World, I haven't played any other Switch 2 game. What I have been playing have been classic Switch games that haven't finished, or, in my opinion, were just performing terribly. Notably, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. While I've made my opinions abundantly clear how I dislike this game because of how poorly it runs, it received an update to be more optimized for the Switch 2, which doesn't really improve the way the game looks. It still looks like it was originally designed on a GameCube, but even still, a GameCube looked better than this. If you ever go back to play some of the Pokemon games when they come out for the GameCube Online stuff, you'll notice some of the Pokemon games like Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness, that game looks phenomenal. And comparing that against Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, you're like, why does the mountain use the same texture copy and pasted over and over and over again? Though the Switch 2 doesn't improve the way it looks, it does drastically improve the way the game physically performs. So you can run around the world without the game dropping to 4 FPS, or you can fully go through a Pokemon battle without frame drops due to the combat animations. It's not even necessarily games that got specific Switch 2 updates. There are games like Pokemon Sword and Shield that, while it didn't have massive performance issues, just generally feel a lot more consistent and smoother on the Switch 2. Most original Switch 1 games, while might not necessarily receive a dedicated Switch 2 update, will see a more sustained level of Switch 1 performance. For example, games like The Witcher 3 on the Nintendo Switch doesn't run appreciably well, and it has dynamic resolution scaling, and all of the things that they do to make the game to be able to run are things that simply run better on the Switch 2. The Switch 2, while not necessarily actually changing the way the game renders or anything like that, it just maintains a steady level of performance. Instead of the Switch 1, dropping the resolution down to as low as like 240p, the game maintains a pretty much static resolution of 640p. Though the Switch 2 is significantly more powerful and could probably run the full game without very little issue, it's because that it's still technically running the Switch 1 version, it's gonna still look like a Play-Doh game. But at least it's going to be a consistent 30 FPS at a, yes, relatively low resolution, but it runs significantly better than the original version. Same thing applies to games like LEGO Star Wars Skywalker Saga. That was one of the games that I played on the original Nintendo Switch, and I couldn't even get past the first couple levels because, Jesus Christ, does that game run like absolute horse crap on the Switch 1. It just wasn't great. It was a terrible resolution. The frame rate was terrible. And whenever you're in any of the open world areas, it just was one of the most lackluster experiences I've ever had. It was frankly more disappointing than Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, for me on a personal level, because I love the LEGO games, and traditionally they've always run fairly well on Nintendo systems. So while the game still doesn't exactly look great on Switch 2, at least it runs more consistently. So overall, my initial experience with at least the games on my Switch 2 has been overall quite positive. Though the launch lineup was disappointing, at least for me, for many people, it's been fantastic in diving into Cyberpunk, playing things like Civ Meyer, Civilization, whatever number that one's on. And games coming up are getting people very excited. Though my excitement isn't really there, I'm just a really picky person. My personal dream is to see Destiny 2 come to the platform, but seeing that Bungie's now owned by Sony, I don't see that happening anytime soon. As it stands for the hardware of the Switch 2 a month later, I'll be honest, it's fine. I'm a predominantly portable mode gamer, and there has been some controversies with things like the display. People have described and experienced some pretty gnarly ghosting issues. I don't know if it's that because I already have pretty bad eyes, having glasses and everything. Laying in bed, I really don't notice any ghosting or artifacting or anything of that nature. And playing in dock mode, obviously, you won't really notice that because it's a different display. So in portable mode, the ghosting issues that people have described, I don't know if it's because I've got a golden sample or something, or I just won the lottery, but my Switch 2, in my experience, hasn't had any ghosting whatsoever. At least that I have noticed. The Joy-Cons are unfortunate. I am really looking forward for when Nixie or Hori or one of the many other companies out there who've made Switch one sort of pro controller Joy-Con things that are incredibly comfortable, massive meaty handles, and gigantic full-size thumbsticks. Because I'll be honest, the new Joy-Cons, while super impressive, still aren't the world's most comfortable thing. The ergonomics of the Switch 2 are not fantastic, and it's by design. So I don't necessarily blame Nintendo for doing this, but I still dislike the analog sticks. They feel pretty much the same as the originals, but hopefully these ones are less prone to Joy-Con drift, and them being physically larger is nice, but it doesn't really change the overall experience. When it comes to battery life on the Switch 2, people have complained quite a bit, it being not particularly amazing, but I'm coming from a Steam Deck and my original launch Nintendo Switch. I never got an OLED, I never upgraded to a red box Switch, and never had a Switch Lite. As the Switch changed over time with new revisions, the battery life dramatically got better over time. By the end of it, the OLED being able to have upwards of 9 to 8 hours or something with battery life when playing some games, that is honestly fantastic. But the Steam Deck and the original Switch famously have terrible battery life. In the Steam Deck's case, you can maybe get an hour of gameplay if you're playing a game like Elden Ring. But if you're playing something like Stardew Valley, you can probably squeeze out 4 hours if you tune the power settings just right. And for the original Switch, playing something like Breath of the Wild will drain you in about 2.5–3 hours if you're lucky, and given the state of my Switch before it died, that really worn out battery, it would barely probably get you to 2 hours. So at the end of the day, the Switch 2 just sort of feels like a fresh version of a launched Nintendo Switch. Getting the 3 to 6 hours, depending on what game you're playing, shtick again, is fine in my opinion. I'm not expecting a huge amount, and I don't leave the house without a battery bank for the basis of my phone, AirPods, and any other miscellaneous tech accessories that I have. It's just good practice to carry a battery bank because you never know if you might be stuck in traffic or get stuck somewhere waiting for like your prescription to be filled at the pharmacy or something. And it's always just good practice to keep a battery bank on you. So I'm never too far from an outlet. And with the supposedly safer charging methods that you can do now with the Switch 2, it being generally considered safe to use chargers that aren't the first-party charger, and which is nice, but you can't use third-party chargers with the dock. It's a whole thing, and the dock situation can be incredibly frustrating. Though the Switch 2 has not gone without controversy. Nintendo game key cards have ravaged the internet with just awful conversation, because I'll be honest, game key cards are, by function, incredibly stupid. I simply don't understand why Nintendo simply won't have alternative size options outside of the 64GB game cartridge. While 64 gigs is nice for games like Cyberpunk, who managed to fit their entire game on it, games that are smaller than that simply don't need 64 gigs of space. Even Nintendo first-party titles like Mario Kart World is only 21.9 gigs or so. A game cartridge the size of 64 gigs is simply unnecessary. It's really pretty much of, how do you like your DRM, digital or physical? Conceptually, I can understand why game key cards exist. They make a lot of sense in some reality. But as it currently stands, the way they are implemented in the game share system on top of that makes the system incredibly annoying and relatively pointless. Since the entire game is not even on the cartridge, you have to download the entire thing. And with 256 gigs of storage, games like Split Fiction, Street Fighter 6, those games are upwards of 70 gigs. While yes, the 32 gigs on the original Nintendo Switch was just pittance, on the Nintendo Switch 2 with 256 gigs, that's still simply not enough for a handful of games that are from a native to the Switch 2. You can't even fit half of the Nintendo Switch 2's launch lineup on a Nintendo Switch 2 all digitally. I didn't run the math, but I'm fairly confident saying I don't even think you could fit a third of the games from the launch lineup on the Switch digitally. On top of that, with the new storage standard requiring you to spend upwards of $60 for just 256 gigs of storage with a microSD Express card, that is awful. I got a 1TB microSD for my Switch for $50. I do understand that the reason why they went with this new storage microSD card standard thing is that it has the required data speeds to match the internal storage. Much like how the Xbox only allows you to download Xbox Series X games onto SSDs, you can't install them onto a hard drive. So it's pretty much the only way to upgrade your storage space to download more Series X titles is by getting one of their storage upgrade modules, which is, if you crack it open, essentially just a 2230 SSD on a little adapter mount thing to be more safe to have portable and external. Proof enough, you can just go onto Amazon and buy a little cradle to build one yourself. So it's annoying. Don't buy the first party ones. You can save a lot of money just literally making one yourself. I simply would have just preferred Nintendo, instead of having a micro SD card slot, have a 2230 size SSD spot. You know, just unscrew a little panel on the back and you can slide one in. I simply do not see how they couldn't have done that. Though that is a level of technical proficiency and awareness that I simply don't think Nintendo has. They don't like using brand new, or I wouldn't say necessarily brand new, but current technological standards. They like being a little more behind. Something that does concern me for the future of the Nintendo Switch 2 is how long it will last in comparison to its surrounding consoles. The Nintendo Switch 1 came out in 2017. That is roughly about 4 years after the initial launch of the Xbox One and PS4. The Switch 2 came out this year. The initial launch of the PS5 and Xbox Series X was 2020, 5 years ago. And with speculation of the next generation of Xbox and PlayStation coming in 2026 to 2027, I'll be honest, the lifespan of how quality the games will look on the Switch 2 might be significantly shorter than it was on the original Nintendo Switch. Because if you remember the early days of the Switch, getting all these amazing ports, a lot of the games just for slightly lower resolution or locked to a lower frame rate than compared to the PS4 and Xbox One. Games like the Doom 2016, that game looked fantastic on Nintendo Switch, and it was only a marginal downgrade compared to the big console alternatives. That can be said for many of the games that came out between 2017 and 2020. A lot of the games that were coming out at that time on the main consoles, and if they saw either a version or a port to the Nintendo Switch, they were, yes, compromised and downgraded, but they weren't this horrendous looking buggy mess. It didn't feel like you were making a huge sacrifice getting the Switch version. But like a year or two into the new generation, the Switch started to look really bad in comparison, because Nintendo loves to not release their consoles on a similar cycle to the other two, which is perfectly fine, but I feel like comparison in the future is going to look way worse than it would now. So while the Switch is amazing, and if you can get your hands on one, it is an amazing experience. From what I would actually classify as a great display, the games, though not for me, for a lot of people, they're amazing and a great way to play them portably. And just the overall future for the Switch 2 is looking very bright. So I would still recommend getting a Switch 2. If not for the amazing Nintendo exclusives, the ability to have a more handheld optimized experience in comparison to many other things like PC handhelds. I would love to hear what you guys think though. Are you at all interested in getting a Nintendo Switch 2? Have you got one and you've been enjoying it? What have you been playing? I would love to hear what you guys think about this down below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those just regards down below. And last but not least, have a wonderful day.